that we do every month. In all the offices, all the big offices have a brain talk. And the goal is not so much to sell you anything, is to educate you in some neuroscience thing that you might care about. Tonight we're talking about coffee, which you might care about.
We care about it.
You care about it. I care about it.
We care about it.
I totally care about it. I wake up every morning with too much blood in my caffeine stream. It's really a problem. Anyways, we decided to do a little mini experiment, and we subjected our employees to brain mapping with and without caffeine in their systems. Brain mapping, or QEEG, is one thing we do a lot of here, where we look at the resting activity of your brain and compare it to a reference database and see how unusual you are. And if you've done brain mapping with us, you know we harp on don't have caffeine before you come in that day, because it really throws your brain activity off. Now you'll see why, because it's a huge effect. And we did 4 case studies. John, Sean, a couple other employees did case studies. Often case studies are a little hard to spot what's happening because everyone's a bit different. We have really, really nice, robust data here. It's actually going to show you exactly what's happening in the brain. So thank you for coming. Again, this is our talk on This Is Your Brain on Coffee. Thank you for folks on Facebook and Instagram for joining us as well if you're watching. If John and Sean, you see questions pop up from those sources, just sing out, and you may or may not, and we'll answer them. Some facts about coffee, beyond that it's wonderful, because we all like coffee. It was discovered about 800 AD or CD in Ethiopia. So Ethiopian coffee is the original coffee. There's 2 kinds of coffee, right? 2 kinds of coffee beans, Arabica and Robusta. Most of us are drinking Arabica beans, which are the ones that most commercial coffee uses. Robusta beans are smaller, more bitter, and have much more caffeine. So it used to be, years ago, like Folgers and things was more Robusta. Nowadays, everyone's going towards the Arabica because they aren't as bitter. So most coffee these days are Arabica driven. 70-80% of the blends are Arabica. We drink a lot of coffee, humans in general. Westerners drink more than Easterners because of the lack of tea culturally being quite so built in the US, we're about 3.2 cups a day on average. Worldwide, 1.6 cups a day. So the US is twice the worldwide average per person. The same for men and women. Roughly the same, no difference. We cannot hold a candle to Finland. Finland drinks at least 6 cups a day per person, generally. And if you've been to Scandinavia, Finns, Swedes, Danes, Norwegians, they all drink coffee all day long until the moment they go to bed. Not all of them, but like you can't find decaf coffee, for instance, in Sweden. Just not possible. Nowadays it is in like tourist shops, but you really can't go buy decaf at a restaurant. It's like, they're like, what? Why would you want that? So heavily invested in, so to speak, in Scandinavia, but also we've been doing this coffee consumption thing for a couple hundred years. And I would argue that things like caffeine, be it in coffee or tea, fueled a lot of expansion. It's why we could work longer hours. It's why we hopped on ships and crossed oceans and conquered countries when we were pre-industrial. So caffeine has driven, it's one of the first drugs we've used for more than 1,000 years, right? And there's very few drugs we've used historically, culturally, for that long. You know, we've been altering our brains since we've had brains. You know, when we were mildly intelligent cavemen, we probably grabbed fermented berries and went, ooh, we're getting kind of, you know, fun feelings from this. And that started our exposure, or ate mushrooms or other things in the ground and had experiences. Well, once we found things could affect our brain, we tend to reinforce that experience. Caffeine produces a lot of alertness. And you would think that once we discovered that everyone would just go after coffee, but there's been several attempts over the past several hundred years to ban coffee. Even in Sweden, which is pro-coffee, as recently as like maybe 80 years ago, tried banning coffee in the country, it didn't work. And Italy tried banning coffee for a couple of years ago, it didn't work. Because the people feel that it's getting in the way of society. People are like hyperactive. In the 1700s in England, women were reporting that it was making their husbands lazy in the evenings. They tried to outlaw it and make it only useful people above 60 years old, which didn't work. So we have this love-hate relationship with substances, of course, our whole cultural sort of life, but coffee's been one that has very few downsides. It was discovered in Ethiopia because the farmers noticed their goats eating coffee cherries and dancing after they ate the coffee beans. If you don't know, coffee bean is actually not a bean, it's a seed. And around it is a pulpy red berry called the coffee cherry. Inside of that is a little bean. So you pulp the fruit, dry it, and then extract the bean. The coffee cherry is actually lovely. It tastes like fruit juice, like fruit punch. The aceola, I think, is the berry, or it's a similar berry to the aceola. You can find coffee juice, coffee fruit juice, in Whole Foods, other places now, actually.
Does it have caffeine?
Yeah, a little bit, not very much. Most of the caffeine's in the bean. There's a little bit in the fruit, so a little tiny bit, kind of a little bit less than green tea or something. So, but you can find the cherries only because now we can ship things around the world better. You know, coffee cherries weren't shelf stable, so we didn't have them culturally in our country 100 years ago. Just like we don't have cashew fruit. You know, the cashew nut actually sits in a leathery pouch underneath the cashew apple. And we don't ever get the cashew apple in this country because it spoils before you get it out of the places where cashews grow. So it's the same thing with coffee berries. It's been only recently brought into this industry because it's a fragile thing to some extent. Coffee is the second most traded commodity in the world, historically, above anything else. Above salt, above gold, above medicine. What do you think the first one is, the number one? Any guesses?
Water.
Or tea.
Water's a good guess. Tea's a good guess, but it's actually, coffee's more than tea.
Sugar.
Sugar's a great guess, not true though.
Salt.
We're getting closer. What do humans like to do in the evenings besides drink coffee in the morning?
Oh, alcohol.
Alcohol, wine. Wine is the number one traded commodity history of the world.
Oh.
2, it's coffee.
Oh.
The first webcam in 1993 at the start of the internet watched a coffee pot. That was the first internet web page. Because at the University of Cambridge, they get tired of walking around the building to the coffee pot room when they were taking a break and finding it empty. So they have a webcam on the coffee pot, plugged it through to a web page, and for like 20 years, there was a live web page watching the coffee pot. And recently, that website was shut down, and the coffee pot was auctioned off for like $60,000 at Sotheby's or something, as the first web page. So, how does it affect the body? A lot of ways, and it affects, well, we don't know all the ways. Like, you know, medicine and psychology is always a little bit coarse in terms of our deep understanding. There's some things we do know. It improves lots of things in the body because it's a good source of antioxidants. Coffee is a very rich source of polyphenols, or the sort of, any fruit or vegetables that's brightly colored have lots of polyphenols, antioxidants. And these are incredibly healthy. Westerns get more antioxidants from coffee consumption than all other dietary sources combined. So coffee is actually anti-aging as an antioxidant. 2 to 3 cups a day seems to reduce the risk of Parkinson's and Alzheimer's in the literature significantly. It also, 3 to 6 cups a day, reduces the total cause of mortality lifelong. And that cause seems to be a reduction in cardiovascular disease, stroke, respiratory illness, and accidents all go down if you're a high coffee drinker, because you aren't falling asleep at work or on the road. There's not a drop in causes of death from cancer. You would think with a high antioxidant load there should be, but there's not. So the reduction in death is actually cardiovascular, respiratory, other things like that, not cancer-driven. It's interesting. There are some risks. Caffeine itself is poisonous, but you would have to take a great amount of it to actually kill you. Most people, if they weren't extra sensitive to caffeine, could have about 50 cups of coffee before you hit the toxic level of caffeine. You wouldn't probably feel good. Well, before that, you probably wouldn't keep drinking it. But there's not much caffeine in a cup of coffee. There's between 50 and 100 milligrams of caffeine in a small cup, like an 8-ounce cup you're having, about maybe 75 milligrams. But if you took a teaspoonful of caffeine powder, you would die. And this happens. You can buy caffeine pills and caffeine powder on the internet, and teenagers will slam a couple of Monster drinks and have some coffee and have an energy drink and have a little caffeine and overdose. It happens fairly frequently. So caffeine, raw caffeine, has sales have been starting to be regulated. Yeah?
Just a question from online of what did you say about Parkinson's?
So 2 to 3 cups a day, the gerontology literature suggests there is a reduced risk factor, some multiple. It's not very clear how big a factor it is. But 2 cups a day lifelong seems to be the sweet spot for reducing the likelihood you'll get Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. Some of this is going to be about the mechanisms of these diseases. Both Parkinson's and Alzheimer's have a glycation mechanism that accelerates the disease. Glycation is oxidation of tissue through sugar, basically, through rusting. So if you heat up sugar and carbohydrates in a pan on your stove, it's incredible. It tastes amazing. Like, it's the Maillard reaction that chefs call it. Like bacon or caramel or coffee. Anything where you heat fat and sugar together, you get this beautiful caramel sort of flavor. It's amazing in your kitchen, not so good inside your arteries. That's atherosclerosis, arteriosclerosis, and that's one of the mechanisms that drives Alzheimer's. In Parkinson's, the Parkinsonian plaques and the Lewy bodies are also glycated. And when they get glycated, they rip through tissue and cause dramatic failure of brain tissue. Coffee seems to offset the oxidation in some way as an antioxidant. And so it seems to blunt the likelihood you'll get it and decrease the progression of these diseases. It also seems to offset diabetes a little bit. It seems to stabilize blood sugar and can slow down the progression of diabetes.
Does it offset glycination?
Caffeine itself does not offset glycation, but the polyphenols in the coffee bean should. I don't think it's ever been demonstrated. It does seem to reduce the risks of that glycation long term, so it's probably reducing it in some way. The mechanism isn't well understood, but it does reduce the progression, the incidence, the severity of Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, diabetes.
So it reduces the likelihood, does it also reduce the severity?
I think so. The research isn't super robust there, but global studies will highly correlate lifelong caffeine consumption day to day versus reduced risk factors long term. These are really complex phenomena.
Meaning
So.
how lifelong? What if you-
Meaning the studies that are done in elders, the best studies are longitudinal, not
So
cross-sectional.
if you started it at 40, is that lifelong?
It's fine. Yeah,
And
it's
you're
fine.
70
What I'm
now?
saying is the research looks across progression in life to validate the research, but you can get benefits at any age. Yes, so you can get benefits now. Absolutely, yeah.
Sure, thank you.
There are some downsides. As again mentioned, it's poisonous. You can overdose on it in raw forms or pure forms of caffeine. Some people are also sensitive and get anxiety drivers really boosted from caffeine or coffee, or get cardiovascular gut issues. If your heart or your gut or your mind is sensitive to being overdriven, you might not especially enjoy large amounts of caffeine. And you may not want to go after coffee, you may want to go after tea instead. Tea comes along with another amino acid that's not present in coffee. The tea leaf contains caffeine almost as much as coffee does, but it also contains L-theanine, which is an amino acid that is GABAergic, very calming. So together, the caffeine and the L-theanine produce this sort of smooth push and not a jittery push. So if you get overstimulated from coffee, tea will, and tea doesn't do that for you, it's the L-theanine as the difference. And you can actually take capsules of L-theanine with your coffee and get the same effect as you would from tea.
Could you spell that?
L-theanine. It's the amino acid naturally occurring in tea leaves that is GABAergic. It produces a calming neurotransmitter in the brain, essentially.
So if you're stressed, take an L-cap.
L-theanine can drop stress, but your body adapts to GABA changes very rapidly. So L-theanine, if you keep taking it, will stop working. It won't produce any addiction or anything, but it won't be as calming if you take it for that purpose a lot. So I like to balance the overstimulation of caffeine with it. It seems to really work beautifully and keep it pretty low as well. But I know people take it for anxiety, take it for sleep onset. It can work for that. Let's see. So how does it act in the brain? Here's some molecules. The top one's adenosine. The bottom one is caffeine. Adenosine is a neurotransmitter and an amino acid that has lots and lots of features and factors in the brain. Among other things, it's involved with the relaxation of vasculature, the blood vessels. When you go to sleep, one of the things that has to happen is your blood vessels open up to allow more blood to rush through your brain and body, and actually the brain goes into an agitation cycle to literally wash the brain free of toxins the way your washing machine does with your clothes. And cerebrospinal fluid gets washed in the brain and drained out when you're asleep. That can only happen if blood vessels are nice and wide, i.e. you're deeply rested. So as you fall asleep, the sleepiness, part of that's an adenosine phenomena, building up, you're telling your brain up, you're getting sleepy. And then once you are asleep, a big adenosine signal opens up blood vessels. Caffeine binds to the adenosine receptor in the brain, and it's what we call antagonistic. It prevents adenosine from binding to that receptor, but it doesn't trigger the receptor itself. The caffeine, it blocks the receptor, occupies it, and prevents adenosine from getting in. So it works counter to the adenosine mechanisms in the brain. So you can actually use this coffee naps. You guys ever take a coffee nap where you take some coffee and go to sleep and wake up half an hour later, 20 minutes later, an hour later? If you don't do that and take a nap and wake up half an hour later, you might feel foggy, right? You ever take a nap and wake up and, oh, I didn't get enough sleep. I did a little too much of a nap and not enough of a real sleep, and you're weird, you're wiped out, you're foggy, you're fatigued. That's because of the adenosine, causing a big change in your brain activity. If you slam coffee and then go to bed for a nap and wake up half an hour, 45 minutes later, you wake up without any adenosine effect. So you wake up super clear and super crisp. So you can actually kind of use this thing if you want to take a nap. Let's see. So caffeine for many of us produces arousal, physiological activation. And this can be stressful. Now stress is not a bad thing by itself. In fact, I've given you here, this is the Yerkes-Dodgson curve, the classic curve of performance versus stress. I.e., if you're not stressed at all, lying in bed doing nothing, your performance is very, very low. If you're a little stressed, challenged, your performance actually improves. A little more stress, performance improves some more, and eventually you plateau, and then increased stressors degrade your performance. You can do this with caffeine if you aren't careful. 1 cup of coffee, ooh, I'm on. 3 cups of coffee, okay, I'm really, really on. 17 cups of coffee, you can't, point yourself in any particular direction. Maybe you're anxious, maybe you're scattered, and may have had a little too much coffee today. So this curve is true in general for humans. As stress goes up, performance changes. And for anything, we should look at the things that activate us and try to get into the sweet spot, but not too activated or too underactivated. And for many of us, we don't have a good sense of what caffeine does. We just have a lifestyle habit. Oh, I have 2 cups a day. But you probably sort of graded the amount you're getting to put you in the middle of that sweet spot, because you don't like to have more than that because it impairs your performance or your sleep or your attention. Also, those are moment-to-moment demands. Over time, if a stressor occurs, the system ramps up to respond to it. But if you sustain high levels of stress over time, the system stops adapting. And eventually, you fail regulation challenges. So you need day-to-day stress to manage your engagement, but chronic high stress will actually impair performance long-term. So if you're doing 7, 8, 9 cups of coffee a day, you're probably living out in chronic stress land, high cortisol, and impairing hormone production, maybe. And if you're out here on this end of things, you're not going to be well regulated. Eventually the system falls over. That's where we get anxiety, sleep disruption, etc. Okay, so we did a little mini experiment here with some of our illustrious peak brain employees. And we did 2 things in terms of testing. A brain map called a quantitative EEG, where we measure resting brain activity compared to a normative database and see how weird people are. And then we also did an attention test, where we look at sustained focus and impulsivity on audio versus visual tasks. So the brain mapping, it compares people to population databases, and we end up with what we call discriminants, statistical unusual patterns that jump out that may or may not mean things. So we don't use them as diagnostics, but we use them as sort of prognostics or hypothesis generators. Oh, this often means X, Y, or Z for an individual. And 9 times out of 10 it probably does, but we don't go top-down diagnostically. We just use this data to inform our understanding of someone's brain. And then the attention test is what's called a CPT, a continuous performance task. And continuous performance tasks are very good at picking up things like ADHD, brain injuries, concussions, etc. But they're not so good at picking up the nuanced experience of your mind. So we use this as a course check of how well you can stay engaged and how well you can inhibit automatic responses. For this test, it's ridiculously boring. Most CPTs are very, very boring. I know some of you guys would have taken the CPT, the IVA we use, but I'll describe it. We flash a number on the screen, about 2 inches high. The numbers are 1 or a 2. Or we speak a 1 or a 2 over the speakers. One of those things happens. It happens about once per second for 20 minutes. 1, 2, 2, 2. Ridiculously boring. So you space out and miss trials, that's inattention. Or you click on things you shouldn't, that's impulsivity. So in this test, you click on the 1s, don't click on the 2s. But of course, this is not a very heavily loaded test, so you're performing at your worst to some extent. All of us who have attention difficulty can perform extremely high when the environment demands it. Threat, danger, excitement, we're really on. The trope of the ADHD teenager playing video games for 20 hours straight without a break is true, because you can ramp up those resources. But In this case, the CPT does the opposite. It has you perform at your worst. So here are some examples, some outputs from CPT data. So what I'm going to do is for 4 people, I'm going to show you the changes in attention and the changes in their brain, one at a time. They're a little different person to person, and you can sort of see how for different people in different resting brain states, it produces slightly different change. So there's 2 sides. Here's the pre and the post, and for each of these I have 2 sets of data. One's labeled attention quotient. This is sustained focus, staying on, not missing things. And one is labeled response control, which is clicking when you don't want to, being impulsive. Or essentially clicking on the 1 successfully and not clicking on the 2s successfully. For all these scores, they're age normed, where 100 points is average, and about 12 points is a standard deviation. So for this first person, he was performing 131% of average for attention. Ridiculously good, about 2 standard deviations above average for staying engaged. Really, really high scores. His impulsivity was average, 102. His attention jumped from a 131 to 137 with caffeine on board. Half a standard deviation of change, which is probably significant. The impulsivity went from 102 to 107, not much of a change, still improved. And if you look at some of the individual scores, visual attention went from 120 to 134, more than a standard deviation. Visual impulsivity didn't change. Auditory impulsivity, 103 to 112. So these are about a standard deviation of improvement overall, half to about 1.5, depending which metric we're looking at. So this person went from having above average attention with a few bottlenecks. Whenever you see the bars kind of dipping, it means that one resource is low and other ones are being used preferentially. That still happens here. So the resources, the pattern didn't change, but everything got elevated slightly. Now, what did this guy's brain do? His caffeine-free brain is on top, his caffeine-laden brain is on the bottom. Now, these are brainwave maps. You haven't seen these things before. We have frequencies in columns, delta through high beta, slow through fast brainwaves. And the colors are scaled based on this color bar. It's a population comparison bell curve. So red, or orange in this case, is a couple standard deviations excess, or more than average, of theta. Sorry, of alpha, I lied to you, alpha. Alpha, if you make a lot of alpha, is an inattentive frequency, a spacey frequency. This is an eyes open map. And most people, when they open their eyes, shut down alpha. They kind of bring resources online. If you open your eyes and alpha persists, it's inattention. If it's very bad, it's ADD. So this individual had some excess alpha initially off of caffeine. And after the caffeine came in, we have about a 1 standard deviation drop in the excess amplitude of alpha. So caffeine on board, this person looks pretty typical. We don't see the ADD-ness in his brain. Off of caffeine, I can see what his brain looks like, but with caffeine on board, there's no real dramatic biomarker anymore. It's kind of really, really hidden. Oh, one of the things shows up for this guy, I'm not sure you can see with the contrast. You see this little feature right here, little orange spot? It gets stronger. This is an area of the brain called the anterior cingulate cortex. When your anterior cingulate's a little extra active, it means you have a touch of rumination or perseveration. Songs that stuck in your head, maybe you're a touch OCD. It's those sorts of things, that switching nature getting spun up a little bit. For this individual, even though his inattention improved, his front midline beta got worse by 1 standard deviation. It drove up some anxiety, a touch of anxiety for him. So we see more focus, but a little bit of anxiety creeping up with caffeine. So this guy now knows that caffeine makes him feel more alert, but oh, that's why it makes me feel a little bit on edge sometimes. So. Oh, sure, sorry. Start it off.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah. So for this individual, some benefits broadly, and a little tiny hint that it might be driving up some rumination. All right, here's somebody else. This individual had a little bit more change. The inattention was a bigger deal for this person. They were a 52% of average. They were missing lots of trials in the attention test. And if you look at auditory versus visual, it's very much an auditory thing. There's one particular resource here called Vigilance, which is noticing the new thing. Oh, there it is. And for this individual, she had 74% of average vigilance for visual cues, flashed things, but only 11% vigilance compared to typical, for spoken cues. So she was missing a lot of the auditory input, really dramatic auditory inattention, and a little bit of visual inattention as well. After caffeine, the vigilance went from 11 to 59. Still not great, still a few standard deviations off of typical, but a 3 standard deviation change in her performance. It's a really dramatic performance. Yes?
What time of day were these performed and how many cups of coffee?
These were 1 cup,
Yeah.
and for her it was the afternoon.
Less than 10 ounces.
Less than 10 ounces. So it's about 75, 80 milligrams of caffeine. Hers were done in the afternoon, everyone else was done in the morning. And so her results are a tiny bit different, I think, because she was more in caffeine withdrawal. Actually, everyone else, the other 3 people that did it, have very similar changes. Hers are a tiny bit different. But she's not the same as the other 3 people. I mean, whatever you start off with is the resources that get modified. So she has a touch more anxiety, a touch more inattention to start with. You see the inattention here, dramatically. It gets blunted really nicely here. The resources get brought up. And for impulsivity, it was pretty good for her, 93% of average, and went to 105% of average. She had a solid standard deviation of self-control improvement on caffeine. So more of a behavioral change for her than the first person. Here's her brain. Oddly enough, we see some executive function, extra theta, didn't really change on caffeine. We see some of that front midline beta, some of the rumination or anxiety markers are suppressed with caffeine with her. It actually made her feel more relaxed from the data perspective. And this person carries around a fair amount of anxiety. So I'm not surprised I was seeing it at baseline. I was a little bit surprised to see the caffeine that reduced it actually. And we know that her performance improved along with the brain change. That's with the previous slide. So for whatever reason, anxiety markers for this person are getting suppressed by caffeine. That does happen. Some people have caffeine or coffee and feel calm. It's not that common. But some people drink it and go to bed. My grandfather, he was an old Navy man, they drank coffee all day long. He died recently, but he would still have a cup of coffee and go to bed, even at like 90. You know, and probably one reason he lived as late as he did, as clear as he was, because he was using caffeine. Also, for about 3% of people with ADHD, caffeine works like Adderall. Works for it to be inhibitory. Only 3%. It's a very small percentage of those people with ADHD. So it's 3% of an 11% total population that has a calming effect from caffeine. She may be one of those people. This is the first hint I have that she's one of those unusual people with some inattention that responds very well to caffeine. It's not generally a good way to treat ADHD, but every so often it works. All right, here's somebody else. He had 41% for auditory vigilance. He's also a bit soft in his auditory attention. That jumped to a 74. So 2-3 standard deviations. That's nice. Overall, 77 went to a 99. He went from impaired to more than 2 standard deviations below average to totally typical in his attention with caffeine in his system. This guy eliminated inattention completely at a broad level, 77 to 99 points. It's a really big change. Impulsivity went from 82 to 93. So almost a standard deviation for impulsivity control. He's still a little impulsive though, with caffeine on board. Let's see. You see that a lot of the scores got a little more regular too. So over here he's using stamina and prudence or monitoring very much because he's not very consistent, he's missing things. And so when you use your stamina a lot, it means you're trying hard, and prudence means you're monitoring carefully. But when your consistency is low, you're trying hard and monitoring carefully because you know you miss things, because you know you're impulsive. So you're extra careful. And the mismatch in resources to make up for the big deficit has gone away, even though the scores haven't come up completely in a typical range. It's still a nice improvement. And it's a much better use of the resources than having a little divot in there. All right, this is his EEG. This guy has a lot more going on than the first couple of EEGs you've seen. They're really classic features. Extra theta's impulsivity, capital ADHD. Extra alpha can be a few things. It's usually inattention, which we saw for him on the previous slide. His alpha's also got a left front focus, which means he's probably dealing with some depression. With caffeine on board, the theta is suppressed a little bit, but more importantly, the inattentive features of the alpha and maybe even the mood features have been suppressed with caffeine. So he's getting significant changes in his executive function, but I would also ask him questions about mood based on the data. I haven't talked about his experience. I'm going off the pure performance scores in the data right now. But I would guess he gets a mood lift from caffeine because I'm seeing front left alpha, which is a mood marker. It probably means your mood's a tendency to get depressed. When your frontal lobe is reversed that way, usually we have more alpha on the front right, but if it's reversed, it goes to the left, it means you tend to go glass half empty, avoid the world, be a little negative. And he had some of that marker initially, and it goes away. He also had back midline for rumination initially, and it makes him feel less anxious, apparently too. So we're getting some really interesting results across different people. But you see how we're seeing the same thing. Suppression of slow brain waves, and then for one person, an increase of beta. For two people, calming the beta down into more typical range, which is great. All right, last person. This guy was showing off because he had no attention problems to start with. 117 was great. So he's more than a standard deviation, more than about 1.5, better than average at staying engaged. And he went up to 125. So he went from 1.5 standard deviations to 2 standard deviations above average with caffeine in his system. And his impulsivity went from 109 to 114, slight increase. Are there any bars that moved a lot? Not dramatically. The patterns changed a little bit. Stamina, 86%, so that's getting that's a bottleneck, went to 109. So the only bottleneck, the only thing below about a standard deviation, below 88%, is this score here. So it's the visual stamina, not responding automatically to the visual cues. And he was okay to start with. 86 is right in the edge of getting in your way. But after caffeine, 109. So 1.5 standard deviations or so of improvement. And these are done the same day. So these are really quick changes. Brain maps do not change year after year after year until you do something to your brain. So we're seeing sort of, again, as I mentioned earlier, I make you not have caffeine for brain mapping, and we're really careful because it hides things. Well, for this project, we decided to use that feature to see how much it is stored in the brain. And it's by 1 to 3 standard deviations. And all 4 of these people just so happen to look like they're getting mostly better on the brain maps and better on the attention test. There's just a little tiny bit of anxiety markers creeping up for 2 of these people. But most things for all 4 of them have moved in the right direction.
Were all 4 of these participants habitual coffee drinkers?
3 of them were. 3 were habitual coffee drinkers. 1 was a habitual energy drink drinker. Doesn't drink coffee, but he had coffee for this.
Yeah.
So none of them were caffeine naive. They all had between 300 and 600 milligrams a day. 600 is a lot. 300 is about standard, 2 to 4 cups a day. So it wasn't a big difference across the 4 people. If I could have a few more people with different baselines of caffeine consumption, my guess is we would see some effect in the data of the caffeine consumption against your normal consumption rates. But with 4 subjects, the power analysis didn't show that we would see anything, so I didn't bother giving the ANOVA. So, but good question. All 4 of them are caffeine users. So. Let's see. This is this guy's brain, the 4th guy, fourth person. He shows some, it's a flavor of theta that means some impulsivity, also means a bit of rumination. It's an atypical sort of rumination marker. When the front switcher is a bit disinhibited, it tends to switch and spin its wheels a little bit. Also some extra alpha, which is inattention and or sometimes anxiety for people. And this gentleman suppressed his theta by about 2 standard deviations of change, and the alpha dropped by about 1 standard deviation of change. So again, we're seeing the same kinds of things. Better executive function markers by reduction in theta and alpha, and he doesn't get any increase in beta, which we would consider an increase of anxiety or arousal potentially. We don't see that. Physiological arousal, wakefulness, not sexual arousal. So for him, we're seeing, and also delta. Delta slow brainwaves. Look at the amount of delta this guy has. 2 standard deviations in the middle of the head, meaning he's not sleeping deeply at night, so he's walking around brain fog during the day because he's not getting enough sleep delta at night, so the brain's pushing back and making it when he's awake. But with caffeine on board, that drops by a standard deviation. So we're getting robust effects on all of the brain waves pretty much for all of these people, at least when there was big outliers. So this is why we are so critical about caffeine before brain mapping. But it also means you can use this technology if you want to see what things do to your brain. So if you're curious what caffeine does to your brain, we always ask you to come in without caffeine for the clinical assessments, but maybe you want to come in for a couple more with caffeine on board, or L-theanine, or your favorite medication, or something else. And then you can see what it does to your brain and get a little more insight. So this stuff's never purely diagnostic, but it's interesting data, and we should learn from it. We have discovered that caffeine, we know this, right? Caffeine affects the brain, but we discovered how, and it suppresses a lot of ADHD markers and may creep up anxiety markers for some people. It may decrease them for others. We've seen both here in these 4 subjects. So that is all I have for data for you. Can I answer questions? Can I unpack anything further? Yes?
Do you know if there's a difference between, I guess you call it different types of caffeine people can consume? I understand it's probably the same core
Yeah.
breakdown, but like, let's say caffeine that's probably artificial.
I mean, the molecule is the molecule.
Yeah.
So if it's synthetic caffeine versus caffeine in coffee, the caffeine component is the same. The difference is all the other things that come with it. Caffeine in tea comes with L-theanine, so you get a different modifier. Caffeine in coffee comes with a billion polyphenols. Some of those are doing things pro-health, pro-brain. I don't know which they are. It's kind of like cannabis. There's 700 cannabinoids. It's not THC or CBD or CBN doing the work. It's all of them. And we're just now figuring out this like anti-cancer benefits for one of the other 700. This caffeine effect is not just coming from caffeine. It's coming from the coffee. And if we did different types of coffee and enough research, you probably could start distinguishing the effects. But we're seeing the gross effect of the caffeine is the biggest effect. It'll swamp anything else, is my guess. And synthetic caffeine, 100 milligrams, would probably do the same thing. I would actually assume it would at this kind of coarse measurement level.
Do you still get the health benefits with decaf coffee?
You do get the health benefits of decaf coffee. The problem with that is some of the decaffeination mechanisms leave chemicals in the coffee. They're like a synthetic, they put solvents in the coffee to break the caffeine out, and you end up with solvents in your coffee. So look for like a Swiss water decaffeinated, maybe they run water over it, and it leaves the caffeine out over time. Most of the caffeine taken out of coffee beans in the decaffeinated process ends up in soda. It's actually not synthesized for soda manufacturers. I mean, it is, but they also just deliver large trucks full of powdered caffeine they pulled out of the beans to Coca-Cola and Pepsi and all the soda manufacturers.
So are there any studies on, I guess, the placebo effect of drinking decaf coffee?
It's a great question. I don't know. I mean, brain effects like this aren't generally amenable to placebo. You can't control your brain activity, even if you want to. So I wouldn't expect the brain activity to change decaf with placebo effect versus regular caf. The intention results might. You can change how you're performing with placebo. So it's a great question, but I don't know.
You mentioned your grandfather drank coffee.
Yeah,
You know.
yeah.
So my mom's in that age, like 91.
Yeah, keep her drinking coffee.
Well, they were,
Yeah.
and they were worried about her. Doctor was worried about her blood pressure, and they said get her off the caffeine.
No, because it doesn't affect blood pressure unless you're very sensitive until you've hit many, many cups a day. So you can have a little bit and not affect, like 2 cups a day will not affect blood pressure unless you're sensitive to it. And then it's more about your blood pressure being sensitive, not with the caffeine per se. The issue with chronic coffee consumption is not usually the coffee or the caffeine, it's usually the sugar or the large amounts of things you put in it. So sugar and even milk, coffee with milk or cream in it, no sugar, blunts the caffeine absorption and the polyphenol absorption. So you get lower caffeine, slower absorption, and more of it passes through your system without being used if you have milk in the coffee. Now I like cream in my coffee, but I don't put sugar in it because that completely abolishes all of the antioxidation effect to the sugar itself as an oxidant. So if you don't like coffee without sugar, I challenge you to try it for a week and a half or 2 weeks without any sweetener, and you will bitter adapt. After a while, your tongue will start to unfold, and you sort of notice this nuanced, layered flavor, and then you become a coffee snob. That's how it works. Until that, you'll notice coffee is actually good.
What about stevia?
Stevia is an artificial sweetener that appears to pass through the body unchanged,
So you could use that.
theoretically. However, if your insulin system is already Western, dysregulated, you're kind of metabolic syndrome, you have a strong insulin response to any sugar, tasting sugar, Even artificial sweeteners causes the same insulin response if you're pre-diabetic. So yes, you can use artificial sweeteners like stevia if you aren't pre-diabetic. If you are, it causes the same problems.
That
And
would
all
mean a
the-
higher blood sugars.
Higher blood sugar, yeah. And all the other artificial sweeteners have negative health benefits. You know, aspartame breaks down to formic acid, saccharin causes cancer, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So my advice is not to try to replace sweeteners with another sweetener, is to learn, teach your tongue about the range of flavors by not throwing sugar into your system very often.
And if you use like for your cream or almond milk without sugar or hardly any? with
Almond
that?
milk and other non-dairy creamers have a lot more carbohydrate in them compared to,
Yeah.
you know, and even milk isn't good because there's too many carbohydrates. You really should be using full fat cream or half and half only. Because anything less than that amount of fat, the carbohydrate to fat ratio is too high, you get a blood sugar spike, even from milk in your coffee potentially. But cream won't do that. It just blunts the caffeine a little bit. So I recommend no sugar, no sweeteners, and try just cream for a week or two, and you'll notice the flavor changes.
I don't know if I do good with dairy, that's the problem.
Well, you can do black coffee is great too. I'm just saying,
It's so bitter.
Oh, yeah.
it's so bitter.
I have my almond milk with my stevia.
I'm saying try it for 2 weeks. Try it for 2 weeks without any sweeteners
I won't drink
whatsoever.
very much of it.
You will change how
I'd
you
rather
consume
have
it,
tea.
and after a few days, it'll start tasting differently. It'll start tasting less bitter.
How many days is it?
Try it. Sometime between a week and 2 weeks, it'll change dramatically.
You need to drink better coffee, come here for your morning coffee.
That's true. Yeah, and if you can't get over this, you're not drinking good enough coffee. You know, so
I get it from Life Extension, maybe that's not very good.
not sure. Yeah,
They say it has lots of polyphenols, but I guess every coffee does.
pretty much.
I
Yeah.
didn't know.
Even really lousy freeze-dried coffee you get for $1 a can is actually full of antioxidants.
So you're telling me I can come up here for my cup of coffee? Nah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Come on up. Yeah.
Maybe I'll make myself.
Yeah, sir.
Do you brain map during job interviews? And do you keep coffee in the break room?
We do keep coffee in the break room. We don't brain map during job interviews only because the brain maps give us a very 10,000-foot view trait, not state. So it doesn't usually change rapidly. It's usually about a 3 to 6 month period of training your brain and dramatic change. But your map today in a year will look the same if you didn't have caffeine in your system. So it's a very indirect course read on the gross resources: sleep, stress, mood, nothing very nuanced. It changes slowly.
You know, those different people, there's some of the people you'd rather hire and some of them you'd rather not.
Yeah. I mean, from my perspective, we do neurofeedback here. So all of our staff that works for us ends up becoming well-adjusted and good attentive, really attentive, calm, a good listener, aware of their emotions, well-rested. It's like if you worked at a gym, you would work out in your time off. Everyone that works for us trains their brain. So any of the peak brains you walk into, and I have these 20 to 40-year-old employees, and they all seem like they're 90-year-old Buddhist monks. They're all very peaceful and calm because they practice neurofeedback 3 times a week and have all their healthy habits. We're a very pro-healthy kind of corporate culture, and we make time for people to take care of themselves. And that combined with access to neurofeedback and meditation groups and everything else, we have really well-adjusted staff, and they don't start off that way, they get that way sooner or later. So,
How much do you charge to do, when,
well, for you, there's no charge. You've already been a client, and you have there's no charge for future brain mapping for
so
any
I
client.
could do one
Absolutely.
without and one with? for
Absolutely.
free?
Anyone who's ever had a brain map at Peak Brain can have more without charge. So, if you want to come in with and without caffeine in your system,
I will do that.
feel free.
I will
Yeah.
talk to you that. I want to
Absolutely.
see what mine says.
She's gonna do cream and.
No, I'm not gonna do.
That wouldn't show much difference.
No, I'll do your better stuff.
Oh, the concession you're making.
Well, I have to do it this way. Gotta make it right.
All the subjects in the study had the same, the variable for the coffee was the same.
Yes, right? Yeah. Just a cup of coffee. Yeah.
Cool.
And it's our coffee, the pour-over we make here, right? That's what we did. So it's just
Gotta do
standard,
their coffee.
standard pour-over, 10 ounces or less.
But the energy drinker didn't drink energy drink for.
Right, get stained from caffeine that day, and then have the coffee mapped to the coffee again.
Perfect.
Exactly.
Yeah, so how long after the cup was the post-study performed?
45 minutes to an hour and 15 minutes, roughly. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that like the peak time for it, or is that?
Caffeine has a half-life of 3 to 6 hours, depending who you are. 1/2 of one half-life drops the concentration by half.
Mhm.
So if you're a fast metabolizer, a half of a half-life is 1.5 hours. So we just try to get it started before the wane.
Mhm.
But depending on who you are, you may still be ramping up in that first hour and a half. Some people have a 6-hour half-life. And by that same token, drugs affect your brain for 5 half-lives, generally, or more. Caffeine's 3 to 6 hours, it's like 4.5 hours on average. 5 half-lives times 4.5 hours
Is what?
is a full day, around the clock. That means the cup of coffee you had at 8 a.m. is still active in your brain the next morning.
Is that good?
No, it's disrupting your sleep. Coffee in the morning, if you're sensitive, disrupts your sleep that night.
So what, well, there's
You stop drinking coffee after 12, first of all, so you
Oh.
get a couple of half-lives in, because 2 half-lives will blunt the effect quite a lot for many people. But some people aren't able to have caffeine after 10 a.m. or even 9 a.m. without throwing off the sleep architecture the next night.
Oh.
So you have to be aware of that if you're a fast or slow metabolizer
How would you
and manage
know
it.
that?
Well, you'll know if you can handle,
don't-
you can drink it all day long or you can't.
Oh,
You
but
can also
you
have your
stop-
genetics tested and tell if you're a fast or slow metabolizer looking at your genetics, the enzymes you produce to handle caffeine. So you can go to a functional medicine doc and they'll tell you all your amino acids and genes and say, oh, look
yeah,
at you
I
metabolize
think
caffeine
that's
slowly.
right.
So, but you know, because if you're a fast metabolizer, you can drink it all day long and not throw off your
No, I
sleep.
can't do that.
And most people are more like, 4 hours, and so you get 24 hours of effect from the first cup of coffee. But it drops by
It
about
drops.
12 to 18 hours to not a very large effect.
So it's good, but I like the idea of your brain things widening your veins. Is that what you said, your veins widen?
Adenosine does. Caffeine suppresses adenosine.
I know, so we don't want that.
Right. You don't want caffeine to
Not
be
my brain.
suppressing adenosine when
Too
you're
much.
actually sleeping.
So
Unless you're taking a nap, you shouldn't do a coffee nap. Yeah. So, and you should be aware of this. I mean, some people drink coffee way too late in the day, don't get great sleep, they feel stressed the next day, they run too much cortisol, caffeine can boost the cortisol things. So you have to watch this, it's powerful, but it's also manageable for most humans because we're not that sensitive to it. It is habit forming, we develop tolerance, we get addicted to it, but the withdrawal is, I have a headache for a week, not, and not being
No, only
like a
3
serious
days.
drug.
I've done it
3
several
days?
times.
Great. You may be a fast
But
metabolizer
that's
then.
been a long time, huh?
If it's only 3 days for you, maybe a fast metabolizer.
That's just what people tell me, so I do what I tell them.
Are we still doing brain maps in Portland where we get our coffee from?
We just took the system from Portland and moved it actually to San Diego. So we'll have some services in Portland, but right now we don't have the mapping system up there. So we can do mapping right now in Sweden or Denmark, Los Angeles, Orange County, San Diego, and of course St. Louis. So those are the places we have physical stations and staff right now.
Tell me again what fast metabolizer is.
3 hours for a half-life of coffee versus 6 hours as a slow metabolizer, cutting the concentration in
So
your
I
brain.
could drink it later in the day?
If you're a fast
If I'm,
metabolizer.
well, you
Yeah.
said if I only get it.
If you only have a brief withdrawal,
3
then you're
days,
probably a
I
fast
don't think
metabolizer, yeah. Or you don't use that much, and you're not that addicted to it. That could also be 3 days would get clear your system too.
Okay, check it out. I'll stop and see.
Would you expect this same, was it exercise? Like if you structured the study pre and post heart rate elevation?
It's a great question. I wouldn't expect much of a heart rate elevation if the person's in shape.
Let me rephrase the question.
Of course
What
they're not.
would you expect the same change results in terms of performance or the gains if you used, instead of the substance being caffeine, it being an hour's worth of physical
No,
stamina?
you would not see the same change in the brain.
What would you expect?
You
to
would not see any change in the QEEG.
Not in the QEEG?
No. I mean, it's not that sensitive. It picks up very, very coarse things, and exercise is a subtle effect. So I wouldn't expect really any change there. You would have some changes under other modifiers for what you're doing to your brain. But the brain maps are really picking up trait and not state information ideally. So caffeine's a special thing because it does affect the state so quickly. That's why we screen it out. But most things don't affect the brain maps that much.
So something like exercise sustained for a year would affect the brain map
Probably.
versus the pre and post of a 4
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, if I did a brain map on you and sent you out for a workout, you come back and do the brain map, I wouldn't expect it to be any different. But if you develop a significant exercise habit over the next 3 months and then I mapped you, we might, because your growth hormone's different, your sleep is different, your stress response is different, but it wouldn't be anything close to the effect we see with neurofeedback or even 6-month meditation courses. So those are working directly on the brain, exercise is working a bit indirectly.
So we could group exercise, meditation, nutrition over here, caffeine, and perhaps poor sleep, or poor sleep would go over here in the other? Like, what would be the fast actors on the change of the pre and
The
post?
fast things are neurofeedback, meditation is somewhat fast, nootropics, brain injuries, or medication.
Okay.
Those are the things that change your brain fast enough to see in a few days or weeks. Most things, it's like 3 to 6 months of the continual intervention, you get a subtle change. Like your map today, we didn't do anything to your brain for the next year, and a map in a year should look the same, and usually does, unless you get a concussion, age faster than we expect, stuff like that. But otherwise, maps are very, very stable. So even having SSRIs in your system doesn't affect it. Caffeine does. Stimulants like Adderall and Ritalin do. We need you to have a 48-hour washout because that's 5 half-lives. Otherwise, it distorts and hides all the slow brainwaves, and we can't tell what we want to work on. But again, just for the mapping days, not for the training days. So we just get a clean read every so often so we can understand your brain better.
Oh, so that mapping day, you don't get any caffeine all day? I mean,
Just before, just from
just before.
4 p.m. the day before you come in is a caffeine cutoff for the
But the stimulants
QEGs.
is 48 hours.
For Adderall, it's 48 hours, and Ritalin.
Oh, I know.
Yeah. So, and most things, other things we don't have you change, we just try to record before. If you have a double handful of supplements and meds you take every day, we record before that, ideally.
I remember that. Do you give us these kind of pictures?
Absolutely, yeah. If I haven't given you yours, just send me an email, I'll send you all your data.
No, that's okay, I want to do this.
Oh, great. Well, I'll definitely do this for you. Yes, yes. You're welcome to get the data.
I really want to.
So have you done,
Hope
or
I
I
have
guess,
orange.
are there, I guess you call it cultural comparative studies of before and afters? Because you mentioned that like Norway is like 6 cups a day on
Yeah,
average,
Finland, yeah,
or
yeah.
Finland, and then here it's like 3.2.
Yeah. There would be some differences only because of tolerance.
Yeah, I was my.
Basically, a
core
100
question.
milligram cup of coffee, a caffeine coffee, in a Finn versus like a Chinese guy who doesn't do a lot of coffee. There's a different tolerance level
Well-
in the Finn versus the Chinese guy.
Yeah.
So that's not going to hit them as hard because their tolerance is so high. But a naive Finn and a naive Chinese guy should have the exact same brain effects. There should be no cultural effect that can't be explained by things like tolerance and exposure already. There's no effect of culture on the brain generally.
Well, I was wondering not just by tolerance, but I mean, if I don't know how long Finland and that region has been drinking 6 cups of coffee a day, but you know.
For
it's
like 50 years. Yeah,
Okay, well,
yeah.
I was going to ask if like, you know, over sustained generations, that'd be something that could be an evolved tolerance even.
It's interesting. Yeah, I mean, you get multi-generation effects on cortisol. If your cortisol goes up and stays up, your next generations have more reactive cortisol. That usually needs to be a very extreme event to be carried epigenetically into future generations. Like you're in a concentration camp, or being tortured, cortisol goes up and stays up. Your grandkids have reactive cortisol because of your torture experience. That happens. Caffeine probably isn't enough of an effect, is my guess. I have no idea, but that's my guess. So, but there's probably something there. It's a great grad level study. Maybe you should do a PhD and dig into it for us.
I'm already a working professional. I don't have time for that.
Other questions I can answer for you guys? Or unpack
Yes,
more
it was
things?
very interesting.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank
Thanks for
you
coming.
so
No,
much.
my pleasure. So one little plug. This, of course, is Peak Brain. We have neurofeedback services. We also have mindfulness. Sean teaches a Monday night group at 7:30, right? 7:30.
Yep.
Which is free, open, is basic technique. We don't make you chant or smell incense or believe anything. It's simply technique, just short little meditation techniques. And not that there aren't things to be gained from the cultural phenomena around meditation historically, but we don't feel that we want to necessarily couch meditation in any specific terms. We also don't feel it's really necessary. The technique is what we want to teach you. So we have free groups in the Culver City office, Downtown LA office, in St. Louis. We have meditation groups happening several times a week across the different locations. Also, all of our brain training clients get mindfulness instruction if they want it as part of their brain training, part of their neurofeedback. So we have little adjunctive things, because neurofeedback is involuntary. So you get the resources boosted for you the mindfulness is a voluntary engagement of your executive function, and so we like to kind of bring both pieces in for you. So Sean is your Monday night, 7:30. We also have a sort of senior mindfulness coordinators who do a lot of one-on-one work every week with people if they want to do that as well. So I think our next talk's in about a month. You remember what the topic is, John?
I don't.
Okay. I'm not sure our next topic is. It might be it's either sex, drugs, and rock and roll, or it's brain injuries. I forget which it is. But we'll post. It's on the meetup group already, and we'll post it in a couple of weeks on Facebook. So we'll do more of these, and if there's topics you care about or things you want to know about, I'm always happy to learn something new and dig into stuff for you. Part of what I do for my clients is act like your concierge neuroscientist, where you want to unpack something or read a paper or help me understand something. That's part of what we do. So if there's things you care about, I'm happy to prepare a presentation for you.
Yeah, I have something I care about.
Yeah.
What about like when I was an undergrad, I did research with simultaneous stress arousal. So the
Okay.
idea that like what is the stress on a mother because her newborn child's crying, or something like that. I'd be curious to see some research around that.
I do have some one of these talks on anxiety in the brain and what to do about it and how that works. It's probably as close as I can get to that, because what you're describing, while totally germane to stress, is a high-level concept about caregiver burden and sandwich generations where you care for your kid and care for your mom. There's a lot happening there, but it's in the sort of psychosociology world a little more because it has family stuff in it, and I just don't know a lot about it. I can definitely dig into what anxiety does in the brain.
That's good, I'd
So
love to see that.
we'll do that again. I think we did that one last time, so we'll do that in a couple of months.
Okay.
But we have a handful of topics where we cycle, but there's other things you care about, especially neuro things, because that's what I can bring the most for you. Just let me know, and I'll try to, maybe I can add some things what you're interested in to the anxiety talk that I have and flesh it out a bit more, things you care about. So just let me know, and we'll do things for you.
Would that be from different, what about depression in the brain?
Depression's different in the brain than
Now
anxiety
with
is, yeah.
Some of my patients.
I'm sorry?
I'd be interested in seeing what that does to the brain.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate
Some of
the
that might be interesting from.
great. We can put a depression talk together for you. Thank you. Great.
To their brain. Could tell 'em.
Our next talk is scheduled to be This Is Your Brain on Meditation.
Oh, meditation. So
Oh,
about a month or
that's
so,
good.
we're doing
That's
how
good.
meditation
I
changes
like
your
that.
brain, both acutely and over time. And it does. So
It
it's very
does, I will come. You be sure you get that.
Yeah, it helps you, if you
I like
meditate
that.
for 20, I'll give you a little spoiler.
Yeah,
If
okay.
you meditate for 20 minutes a day, you sidestep all of the cortical thinning that comes with aging. The age-related cognitive decline that produces slowed awareness, slowed reaction times, body awareness isn't quite checked in. Meditating 20 minutes a day sidesteps it, and you avoid all the cortical thinning you get from normal aging, not pathological, but normal aging sidestep.
I think that's great.
So-
I'm gonna go from 15 to 20.
There you go. All right, guys, thanks for coming so much. Thanks to Instagram and Facebook people, and take care of those brains, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's very nice.
And you mentioned
Very
something
fancy.